My name is Claire Jennings. I am 32 years old, and the day I finally signed the papers for my first home should have been the happiest of my life. Instead, I opened my front door to find a man I had never met holding a thick manila envelope with my parents' names printed across it in bold black letters. He asked me to confirm my identity, handed me the envelope, and with a look that almost seemed apologetic, muttered the words, "You're being sued by your family." That moment froze in time. The sun was warm on my face, but my hands went cold. I had worked since I was 16, never once asked them for help, never took a dime, and paid off my own education with double shifts and sleepless nights. I had bought this house on my own, every penny accounted for, and now they were accusing me of stealing my younger sister's future. I want you to know exactly who I am before you decide which side you're on, because if you have ever worked yourself to the bone while others drained every bit of your effort without thanks, you're already standing with me. I grew up in a home where love had conditions and loyalty only mattered if it benefited them. My sister Laura was the fragile one the family's golden child constantly cushioned from reality. If she wanted something, it appeared violin lessons, private tutors' art retreats, even a trip to Italy so she could find inspiration for her painting. Meanwhile, I was bagging groceries after school to keep the lights on because the so-called emergency fund had mysteriously vanished into her expenses. My parents liked to tell people that I was independent and strong, but the truth was, they simply refused to help me. When I got into college, I didn't tell them until my tuition was already paid because I knew the only response I'd get was a reminder of how much my sister needed more. They told me countless times that someday she'd thrive, that I just needed to sacrifice a little longer for the family's sake. And for years, I believed them. I believed that working myself to exhaustion was an act of love. But the illusion shattered with a single accident, a voice memo Laura meant for a friend but sent to me by mistake. In it, she laughed about how I was the backup plan for the family. My parents' voices chimed in mocking the idea that I could ever live for myself. It wasn't just careless words. It was the truth they had been hiding in plain sight. That night, I decided I was done playing the role they had assigned me. I would build a life entirely out of their reach. It took 2 years of calculated moves, quietly changing my phone number, locking down my social media, redirecting my mail, and creating an LLC to refinance everything under my own name. I never told them about the new job, the promotion, or the little victories along the way. Silence was my shield. When I bought the house, I kept it to myself. But independence, I learned, is offensive to people who thought they owned you. The lawsuit claimed that my down payment should have gone to fund Laura's master's degree in healing arts and that I had a moral obligation to keep supporting them financially. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about money. This was about control. And if they wanted a fight, they were about to get one they would never forget. I started working at 16, not for pocket money or high school luxuries, but because someone had to keep our house running when my father's hours got cut, and my mother insisted Laura's talents couldn't go to waste. While other kids spent weekends at the mall, I stocked shelves at the grocery store and cleaned tables at the diner down the road. I learned to budget before I learned to drive, and my paychecks vanished into bills before I could even think of treating myself. My parents praised my maturity to friends while sliding envelopes of cash into Laura's hands for her music lessons and art workshops. They called her delicate gifted too sensitive for the grind of the real world. I was the grind. Every time she stumbled, they caught her before she could hit the ground. Every time I stumbled, they told me to get up on my own. In college, I juggled a full course load and 2 jobs, often coming home after midnight to an empty apartment and a pile of assignments waiting for me. My meals came from dollar stores and whatever was on clearance at the market. Meanwhile, Laura posted pictures of herself sipping cappuccinos in Florence, finding herself on a summer abroad fully funded by my parents. They never asked me if I could join. They never even told me she was going until the plane had already landed. I told myself it was fine. I didn't need help. I didn't want to be indebted to them. What I didn't realize was that my refusal to ask for help made it easier for them to forget I was part of the family at all. The stakes rose in my final year of college. My financial aid covered most of the tuition, but there was still a gap I needed to close. I asked my parents if they could help just this once. My mother's side told me the timing was bad, that Laura had been accepted into an exclusive art program that required an advance payment. They couldn't stretch themselves for both of us, so I picked up a third job. I remember falling asleep on the bus more than once, waking up in panic when I realized I'd missed my stop. I graduated without a single cent of their money, wearing a cap and gown I'd bought secondhand, my name called out to an audience where my family sat in the back, barely clapping. I thought I'd proven myself. I thought they'd be proud. Instead, my mother pulled me aside after the ceremony and asked if I could lend them a few thousand to help cover Laura's moving expenses. I told her I didn't have it, which was true, and she smiled like she knew I'd figure out a way to get it anyway. That moment was the first time I felt something hard and cold settle in my chest. I realized they didn't see me as a daughter. I was a resource, a tool, a safety net for everyone but myself. When I landed a corporate job that finally paid well enough to save, I kept it quiet. I wanted to see what life felt like without their demands hanging over me. I worked. I saved, and I bought a modest home that was mine in every legal and financial sense. But the second they found out, the stakes turned deadly serious. This wasn't just emotional abuse anymore. It was a legal battle. They claimed I had stolen opportunities from Laura, that morally my savings belonged to the family, and financially my independence was a betrayal. It wasn't just about keeping my home. It was about defending my right to live without being owned. The first crack in the facade came in the most ordinary way, an overheard conversation I was never meant to hear. I had gone to my parents' house to drop off some documents they needed for a refinancing application. Laura's car was in the driveway, the same one they'd bought her for her birthday when she was 17, still spotless after all these years. I walked in through the side door like I always did and heard laughter from the kitchen. At first, I thought nothing of it. Then, I heard my name. "She thinks she's building her own future," Laura said, her voice dripping with amusement. "We both know she's just holding it for us until we need it." My mother chuckled in response, the sound low and knowing. "Don't say it like that, Laura. She'd be heartbroken if she knew. Just let her feel useful, and when the time comes, she'll give it over. She always does." The words hit me like a blow. I stood frozen, my hand on the doorknob, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. They didn't just expect me to help if they needed it. They were planning for it, counting on it like my money wasn't mine at all. I backed out quietly and left without them ever knowing I'd been there. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed the conversation over and over, each time cutting a little deeper. I thought about the years of double shifts, the rent I paid without asking for help, the times I'd said no to myself so I could keep my head above water. All the while, they saw me as nothing more than an account they could tap into. I started noticing other things I'd brushed off before. My mother's constant questions about my salary just out of curiosity. My father's offhand comments about how families should share their success. Laura's sudden interest in my new job, asking how much I was saving each month, how long before I could afford something nice. I realized they weren't proud of me, they were taking inventory. The betrayal deepened a few weeks later when I got a call from my bank about a suspicious inquiry. Someone had tried to access my account information using security questions only a family member would know. The attempt failed, but the timing was too perfect. I changed every password, froze my credit, and began moving my savings into accounts they couldn't touch. The final confirmation came the day I closed on my house. I didn't tell them, not because I wanted to be cruel, but because I wanted one thing in my life that was mine alone. I moved in quietly, filled the rooms, slowly savoring the feeling of a door that locked behind me without anyone else's key. For 2 weeks, there was nothing but peace. Then came the knock on the door. A man in a rumpled suit stood on my porch holding a thick envelope. "Are you Emily Carter?" he asked. I nodded. "You've been served." Inside were pages of legal jargon, but the meaning was clear enough. My parents and Laura were suing me. The claim that my down payment had been morally and financially earmarked for Laura's graduate school, and that by using it for my own home, I had deprived her of her future. I stared at the words until they blurred. This wasn't just betrayal, it was an attack. And if they wanted a fight, I was ready to give them one they'd never forget. The shock of being served faded faster than I expected, replaced by a cold, methodical clarity I'd never felt before. This wasn't just about money. This was about control. They wanted to make an example out of me, show me what happens when I stop playing the role they wrote for me. And if they thought I'd fold, they had no idea who they were dealing with. I spent the first night pacing my empty living room, the legal papers spread across the floor like a crime scene. Every clause, every accusation, every smug insinuation they'd included was a breadcrumb. They claimed unspoken family agreements existed. They said I'd benefited from family resources my whole life. They painted me as selfish, disloyal, ungrateful. But all I could see was an opportunity to burn their lies down in broad daylight. The next morning, I started my plan the same way I'd started everything in my life with work. Step 1 was evidence. I dug out every pay stub from the job I'd started at 16 the nights I'd closed the diner at 1 a.m., the mornings I'd still shown up for class. Bank statements, rent receipts, tuition payment records, every scrap of proof that I'd carried myself from day one. Step 2 was surveillance. Not in the literal sense, but I started watching them the way they'd been watching me for years. Through a mutual acquaintance, I learned Laura was already telling people that my house had been a family investment I'd stolen. My parents were laying the groundwork for their narrative, dropping hints about my emotional instability and misunderstanding of family obligations. Step 3 was isolation. I cut off all direct contact. No calls, no texts, no emails. Everything went through my lawyer, a woman named Harper with ice blue eyes and a voice that could make grown men stop mid-sentence. "They're suing you on moral grounds," she said, flipping through the pages with a kind of detached amusement. "The problem is morals don't win cases, facts do. And I've never lost to someone with nothing but guilt as currency." That was all I needed to hear. For the next 2 weeks, I lived in two worlds. By day, I went to work, smiled at my colleagues, kept my head down. By night, I built my case. I traced old transactions, found proof that my name had been used to co-sign a loan for Laura without my consent when I was 19, and uncovered a string of mysterious withdrawals from a family savings account that I'd been told didn't exist. Each discovery was a small detonation in my chest, but instead of rage, I felt something sharper: resolve. The closer I looked, the more I saw that this wasn't spontaneous greed. It was a long game they'd been playing for years. My parents had set me up as the reliable one, the workhorse, while Laura was the investment. And now that investment was failing, they were ready to liquidate me. Step 4 was the trap. I knew they'd slip up if they thought they were winning. So I let a mutual contact accidentally mention that my lawyer thought their claim might have merit. Within 3 days, Laura sent a text to a friend, one she didn't know I could access, bragging that she'd finally get the house and that Emily will be begging to settle. That message became Exhibit A. By the time our first hearing was scheduled, I was ready. My evidence file was thick enough to slam on a desk with weight. My witnesses were prepped, and my strategy was airtight. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was dismantling them piece by piece until there would be nothing left for them to stand on. And the best part, they still had no idea how deep this was going to cut. The first thing Harper told me was that lawsuits like this were often decided before they even hit the courtroom, not by law, but by leverage. "If you want to win," she said, "we need to make them realize they're the ones standing on a cliff edge, not you." That meant we had to hit them from every angle, legal, financial, and emotional, until they understood exactly how exposed they were. I started with the financial records. It was tedious, soul-sucking work, but it was also where I knew they'd made their biggest mistakes. I combed through my bank statements, cross-referenced them with their accounts, and began spotting the patterned small withdrawals that added up over time, checks written from a shared family account I'd never been told about, and recurring payments labeled educational expenses that matched exactly with Laura's tuition bills. The thing that made my stomach turn wasn't just the theft, it was the timing. Right before my senior year of college, when I'd been told we couldn't afford my last semester, there had been a series of transfers out of that account to cover Laura's semester abroad. I'd worked 2 jobs, nearly dropped out, and she'd been sipping wine in Florence. The proof was there in black and white. Next, I went after the loan documents. Harper had warned me this would be harder. Banks are protective about releasing old records. But I remembered something: the co-signed loan from when I was 19. Back then, I thought I'd just signed some paperwork for a credit card my parents said was for emergencies. Turned out, it was a $15,000 personal loan for Laura's business idea that never even launched. I'd been paying interest on it for a year without knowing because the bills had been sent to my parents' address. Harper nearly smiled when she saw the paperwork. This isn't just bad behavior, this is fraud, but I didn't want to stop at fraud. I wanted a pattern, a trail so clear that when the judge looked at it, they'd see exactly how my family had been bleeding me dry since I was old enough to earn a paycheck. That's when I reached out to old employers. The diner owner from my first job remembered how I'd worked every weekend and holiday. My freelance clients from college still had emails where I'd explained tight deadlines because I was helping with family obligations. A professor even dug up an old recommendation letter where he'd praised me for juggling work and school with no family support. Every piece added weight to my side of the scale. And then came the voice memos. A mutual acquaintance slipped them to me, a series of recordings where Laura complained about me finally thinking she's independent, and my mother suggesting they remind her where her loyalty should be. In one, Laura even joked about how easy it would be to make me feel guilty enough to hand over the house. Harper listened to them twice, then looked at me with something like admiration. "You realize this is enough to countersue for defamation, right?" I nodded. We weren't just going to defend, we were going to attack. For every claim they made about me stealing from them, we had 3 pieces of evidence showing the opposite. For every moral accusation they threw, we had proof of actual crimes. The more we built, the calmer I felt. It was like stacking sandbags before a flood. You can't stop the storm, but you can make sure it hits them harder than it hits you. By the end of the month, the file was so thick, Harper had to carry it in a separate briefcase. We had bank records, loan documents, witness statements, voice memos, and a timeline of every single instance where I'd been forced to sacrifice for the good of the family while they lived comfortably off my back. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had started this war thinking I'd crumble under the pressure, but all they'd done was give me a reason to dig deeper than I ever had before. The case was no longer about keeping my house. It was about reclaiming every part of my life they'd tried to own. I walked into the courthouse that morning dressed in a simple navy suit, hair pulled back, face neutral. Harper had told me to let the evidence speak louder than any display of emotion, and I was determined to follow that advice. The hallway outside the courtroom was buzzing with voices, but the moment I stepped in, I felt the temperature drop. My parents were already seated with their lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit who smirked like he'd already won. Laura sat next to them in a cream dress, the kind of outfit you wear when you want to look innocent, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. She didn't look at me once. Harper slid the thick file of evidence onto our table with a satisfying thud, the sound turning more than a few heads. When the judge entered the room, fell silent, and the clerk read the opening statements. Their lawyer went first, spinning a story about sacrifice and family duty, painting Laura as a victim whose dreams had been shattered because I had selfishly used my money to buy a house instead of funding her graduate program. He used words like moral obligation and betrayal, and when he gestured toward Laura, she dabbed her eyes with a tissue like she was on cue. I kept my gaze steady on the judge, not giving them the satisfaction of a reaction. When it was Harper's turn, she didn't waste time on flowery language. She laid out the facts like stepping stones, each one leading to the undeniable conclusion that I had been financially independent since I was 16, that I had never received a cent from my parents for my education, and that, in fact, the plaintiffs had directly benefited from my labor and credit. She spoke in the kind of calm, deliberate tone that makes people lean forward, and when she dropped the first voice memo into evidence, you could feel the tension ripple through the room. The sound of Laura's laughter, followed by my mother's voice saying, "She'll be fine, she always is," played clearly over the speakers. The jurors shifted in their seats. Laura's cheeks flushed pink, and for the first time she looked at me just for a second, then away. Harper followed it with the bank statements highlighting the transfers that had funded Laura's tuition, her trips, her failed business. Each page was time-stamped, every figure precise, leaving no room for interpretation. Their lawyer tried to object, claiming irrelevance, but the judge overruled him twice in a row. The final blow of the day came when Harper presented the co-signed loan document, my signature alongside my father's, the funds deposited into an account under Laura's name. The defendant was 19 at the time, Harper said, and was told this was an emergency credit card. The funds were used entirely for the plaintiff's personal expenses. This is fraud. There was no drama in her voice. No accusation, just the kind of cold truth that cuts deeper than shouting ever could. By the time the judge adjourned for the day, their side looked shaken. Laura avoided my eyes completely. My mother's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and my father's jaw was set in that stubborn way I remembered from childhood. Only now it looked more like fear than authority. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered, tipped off by someone about the unusual nature of the case. Harper gave a brief statement about my independence and my right to protect my property, while I stood silently beside her, the picture of composure. Inside, though, I could feel the shift. This was no longer a story they could spin over Sunday dinners to make themselves look like victims. This was public documented and unraveling faster than they'd ever imagined. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going over the notes for the next hearing. I didn't feel triumphant yet. This was just the first battle. But for the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't the one being backed into a corner. The silence in my home felt different now, not just peaceful, but powerful. They had come for my house, my name, my future, and instead, they had handed me the chance to take everything back on the record in front of the very people they'd hoped to impress. And I wasn't going to waste it. The second week of the trial began with a curveball no one on their side saw coming. Harper had been quiet for days working behind the scenes, and now I knew why. She walked into the courtroom carrying not just our original file, but an entirely new binder, thicker, heavier, and marked with a single word in black ink, supplemental. The judge raised an eyebrow as she placed it on the desk. Your Honor, new evidence has come to light regarding the plaintiff's financial conduct directly relevant to their claims, she said, her voice calm but edged with steel. Their lawyer tried to protest, claiming ambush, but Harper simply reminded him that discovery was ongoing and that these records had been obtained legally through subpoena. The judge allowed it. When Harper opened the binder, the first thing she displayed on the projector was a set of wire transfer receipts, my parents moving money from a family education fund into an offshore account registered under my sister's name. The dates matched almost exactly with the times I had been told there was no money for my tuition, forcing me to work 2 jobs to stay in school. You could see the color drain from my mother's face. Harper didn't stop there. She flipped to an email chain between my parents and a so-called family financial advisor, discussing strategic use of my credit history to secure lower interest rates for loans they intended to use for Laura's personal projects. The advisor had even warned them that this was legally risky. My father's reply had been simple. She won't find out. The courtroom went so still I could hear my own breathing. Then Harper played the second bombshell, a recorded phone call from just 6 months before the lawsuit. My sister's voice dripping with casual cruelty, telling a friend, "It's not like she's ever going to stop paying for us. She thinks she's independent, but Mom and Dad know how to keep her in line. This house thing, if she thinks it's hers, she's delusional." You could almost feel the collective intake of breath from the jury box. Their lawyer's face tightened, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk. He tried to object to the recording, but Harper had already laid out the authentication paperwork signed and time-stamped by the investigator she'd hired. That was the other twist Harper had brought in, a private investigator weeks before the trial even began. I hadn't even known the extent of what they'd found until that morning. The investigator had tracked down bank records in 3 states, interviewed former tenants of a property my parents claimed they never owned, and even unearthed a pattern of using family members' names to hide assets from tax authorities. The judge's expression shifted from neutral to something sharper, his pen scratching notes as each new document came into evidence. By the time Harper closed the binder, the mood in the room had shifted entirely. This was no longer about a moral dispute over family obligations. This was about calculated, sustained financial exploitation, and now potential fraud on a scale large enough to interest federal authorities. As we left the courtroom for the lunch break, I caught my sister's eye. She looked smaller somehow, her posture less confident, her hands trembling as she scrolled through her phone. My parents were whispering to their lawyer in low, urgent tones, their expressions tight with panic. Outside, Harper leaned close to me and murmured, "This isn't just a defense anymore. This is leverage." I knew exactly what she meant. If they had any sense, they'd settle before this spiraled into criminal charges, but part of me didn't want them to have that out. Part of me wanted every lie, every theft, every smug word they'd ever spoken about me laid bare in the court record for everyone to see. That night, I sat at my desk flipping through the copies Harper had given me. Each page was a piece of my past I hadn't known was stolen. Each receipt, each email, each note was proof that my years of exhaustion and sacrifice weren't just the result of bad luck or family dynamics, they were engineered. And now, for the first time, I had the receipts to prove it. The game had changed and the endgame was starting to come into focus. The next morning, the air in the courtroom felt heavier, as if everyone could sense that something irreversible was about to happen. Harper looked relaxed, almost casual, as she organized her notes, while across the aisle, my parents and sister looked like they hadn't slept. Their lawyer's voice cracked slightly as he addressed the court, trying to paint the transfers and recordings as misunderstood family arrangements taken out of context. But the jury's faces told another story. They weren't buying it. Harper stood, her voice steady, as she asked the judge for permission to recall Laura, my sister, to the stand. The judge nodded, and Laura walked up with a stiff gait, her hands twisting in her lap as she sat down. Harper wasted no time. "Ms. Grant, can you explain why you told a friend, and I quote, 'If she thinks it's hers, she's delusional,' when referring to my client's home?" Laura's eyes darted toward our parents before she answered. "It was just venting. I didn't mean it literally." Harper tilted her head. "You didn't mean it literally, yet you are here today claiming that the home's down payment should have been used for your master's degree in healing arts. Correct?" Laura shifted uncomfortably. "Well, yes, and the funds you claim were morally owed to you came from the same account you and your parents transferred offshore under your name." "Correct?" Laura's face flushed bright red. I don't handle the accounts. I just do what they tell me. So you admit the account was under your name and that you benefited from funds my client was told did not exist." Laura's breathing grew shallow. "I don't know." "Maybe it's a yes or no question, Ms. Grant." "Yes." The word came out louder than she intended echoing in the courtroom. A murmur rippled through the spectators. Harper let the silence hang for a moment before moving in for the kill. "And would you like to explain why your voice is on a recording discussing how to keep my client financially tied to your family? Would you like to tell the court who you were speaking to when you said Mom and Dad know how to keep her in line?" Laura's composure shattered. Her eyes filled with tears, her words tumbling out in panicked fragments. "It wasn't my idea. They told me to say those things. They said if I didn't go along with it, I'd lose everything." The judge banged his gavel to quiet the room, but the damage was done. Harper's expression didn't change, but I could see the flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. My parents stared straight ahead, stone-faced, refusing to look at their daughter as she crumbled on the stand. Harper gently but firmly pressed on. "So you're saying your parents orchestrated this lawsuit knowing it was built on false premises?" Laura's voice cracked. "I guess, yes." Gasps filled the room. Even the court reporter glanced up for a second. The judge leaned forward. "Ms. Grant, you understand you are under oath." Laura nodded weakly, tears streaking her makeup. "Yes, Your Honor." Harper closed her folder with a deliberate motion. No further questions. The opposing lawyer didn't even try to redirect. The damage was irreparable. Laura's breakdown had just detonated the case from the inside. As she stepped down from the stand, she avoided our parents entirely, her eyes fixed on the floor. My father's jaw was clenched so tightly I thought he might break a tooth. My mother sat perfectly still, her hands folded, but her knuckles were bone white. Outside the courtroom during the recess, I could hear their muffled arguing from the hallway, sharp hissing voices blaming each other for what had just happened. Harper caught my eye and whispered, "We just won the war. Now let's make sure they pay for starting it." I didn't smile, but deep inside, I could feel the shift. They weren't the predators anymore. They were cornered, and they knew it. When the judge returned from chambers, the entire room went silent. Even the sound of shuffling papers stopped as everyone turned their eyes toward the bench. He looked down at us over the rim of his glasses, his expression unreadable. After reviewing the evidence, the testimony, and the financial records submitted, this court finds in favor of the defendant, Ms. Evelyn Grant, on all counts. The plaintiff's claims are dismissed with prejudice. My stomach tightened not from fear, but from the sheer weight of what those words meant. But the judge wasn't done. He glanced at my parents and sister, his voice taking on a sharper edge. Furthermore, the court finds that the plaintiffs engaged in fraudulent activity, including unauthorized use of the defendant's personal information, misrepresentation of financial assets, and attempts to interfere with her independent livelihood. As such, the court orders an immediate freeze of any jointly held accounts, a full audit of the plaintiff's financial transactions over the last 10 years, and referral of certain evidence to federal authorities for potential criminal investigation. A low gasp spread through the gallery. My mother's head snapped toward the judge, her lips parting in silent protest. My father's face drained of color. Laura looked like she might faint. The gavel came down hard. "Court is adjourned." The sound echoed like a gunshot. I didn't move right away. Neither did they. Harper leaned toward me, whispering, "That's not just a win. That's an end game." We stood and walked towards the exit while the bailiff moved to escort my parents and sister toward a side door. My father called my name not angrily, but with a kind of desperate confusion, like he couldn't believe the tide had turned. I didn't even glance back. Outside, the courthouse steps were bathed in late afternoon sun. Reporters hovered on the edges of the crowd, sensing there was more to the story than a simple family lawsuit. Harper shielded me from their questions, her voice curt. "No comment at this time." We reached her car, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "They'll spin it," I said quietly. Harper shrugged. "Let them. By the time they do, the audit will already be in motion and you'll be protected. Their story won't matter when the facts are public record. Over the next week, the consequences hit fast. Their accounts were frozen, their credit lines suspended. The bank called me to verify I was aware of a fraud investigation linked to my Social Security number. I confirmed it, and the investigator on the other end said, "They're in a lot deeper than they think." Through a mutual contact, I heard that Laura's graduate program had revoked her scholarship after learning about the case. She'd have to reapply next year if she could clear her name. My parents, meanwhile, were facing the IRS. Years of creative accounting unraveled in a matter of days once the court-ordered audit began. I didn't celebrate loudly. There were no champagne toasts, no victory laps on social media. I simply went home, unlocked the door to my small but perfect house, and stood in the quiet. My deed hung framed on the wall beside the front window. Below it, in a smaller frame, I'd placed the transcript excerpt where the judge read their names into the record, attaching them forever to fraud and perjury. It wasn't spite, it was closure. For the first time since I was 16, I knew they had no claim over me. No leverage. No power. Just the empty echo of a control they thought would last forever, and it was gone, completely. News travels fast in a small town, but scandal travels faster. By the end of the week, the story wasn't just courthouse gossip, it had made the local paper. The headline was "Sharp and Merciless Family Fraud Allegations, Rock Prominent Grant Household." Below it was a photo of my parents leaving the courthouse, my mother's face twisted mid-sentence, my father looking down to avoid the cameras. The article outlined the fraud investigation, the dismissed lawsuit, and the fact that they'd used my identity to open credit lines. They didn't use my name in full, but anyone who knew us could connect the dots. The comments section was brutal. Former neighbors, old family friends, and even a few of my parents' social acquaintances weighed in. Always knew something was off. She worked herself to the bone and they took advantage. Not shocked about Laura, she always had that entitled streak. My parents tried to control the narrative, calling it a misunderstanding and claiming I had overreacted, but the evidence in public court records made that defense laughable. Even people who'd once been in their corner began to distance themselves. The country club revoked their membership, citing behavior unbecoming of members. My father's volunteer board positions quietly removed his name from their websites. Laura's friends from her sorority stopped inviting her to brunches. One even posted a cryptic story. Some bridges burn themselves. I didn't post anything myself. I didn't need to. The truth had taken on a life of its own. My only public move was donating a portion of my legal fee reimbursement to a local scholarship fund for first-generation college students. The local news picked up on it, calling it a full circle moment for a woman who built her life on hard work and independence. My inbox filled with messages from strangers, mostly women in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, sharing how they'd been financially drained or manipulated by family members. Some thanked me for fighting back. Others said they wished they'd had the chance. The fallout hit my parents hardest in their social circle. They were no longer invited to holiday parties. People they'd once boasted about being close to now crossed the street to avoid small talk. Even my mother's book club, a group she'd led for a decade, replaced her with someone else until things blew over. But things weren't blowing over. The audit revealed even more small business grants in my father's name that he'd funneled into personal expenses, a medical hardship loan my mother had applied for under my Social Security number during my senior year of high school, and several maxed-out credit cards tied to joint accounts I didn't know existed. Every discovery tightened the legal noose, and the possibility of criminal charges was no longer just a threat, it was probable. Through all of it, Laura tried to reach me. She sent 2 letters. The first was half-hearted, dripping with phrases like, "I never meant for it to go this far, and family is all we have." The second, sent after she was dropped from her master's program, was angrier. "You've ruined my life over a misunderstanding." I didn't respond to either. Harper once asked if I ever felt bad about the level of damage they were enduring. I told her the truth, no, because damage implies something was whole to begin with. What they had was never love or respect. It was leverage. And when you take away someone's leverage, all that's left is who they really are. The best part, I didn't have to humiliate them directly. I just stood back and let the truth, once hidden in whispered plans and forged documents, do its work. And it was relentless. The more they tried to deny, the more the town remembered and repeated the facts. This wasn't revenge in the movies with dramatic confrontations and explosive shouting matches. This was real life. And in real life, the most satisfying sound isn't yelling, it's the quiet crumble of a reputation they thought was untouchable. The week after the court ruling, I woke up without the weight in my chest that had been there for years. It was strange, almost unsettling to open my eyes and not immediately feel the dread of the next phone call, the next guilt trip, the next subtle way they'd try to pull me back into their orbit. For the first time in a decade, my mornings were mine. No more, just one more favor, no more pretending to be okay with being the family's safety net. I could drink my coffee while it was still hot, watch the sun come up through my own window, and know that everything in my home had been paid for by my own hands. But the peace wasn't just in the quiet. It was in the realization that I had been valuable all along, long before I could prove it with bank statements or property deeds. They had tried to convince me my worth was tied to what I could give them, to the sacrifices I was willing to make, to how well I could disappear when they needed the spotlight for themselves. But they were wrong. I thought back to being 16, closing up the diner at midnight with sore feet and blistered hands, and how even then I didn't quit. To the nights in college when I'd study until 2 in the morning after a double shift, eating ramen and telling myself it would be worth it someday. To the moments when I wanted to scream from exhaustion but smiled instead because showing weakness would only give them another excuse to doubt me. All those moments, I realized now, weren't about survival alone. They were proof of who I was. I was never just their backup plan. I was the one keeping everything running while they played favorites and spent recklessly. And the fact that I could walk away with everything still standing behind me meant I had built more than a life. I had built a foundation that didn't include them. Harper came over one night with takeout and a bottle of wine, and we sat on my living room floor, surrounded by unopened boxes. "You did it," she said simply, raising her glass. "You didn't just win in court, you won yourself back." I smiled, and for the first time I believed it. She asked if I'd ever consider talking to them again. My answer came without hesitation. No, they had years to value me, and they chose to use me instead. That's not something you come back from. It wasn't anger speaking anymore, it was clarity. Because sometimes walking away isn't about punishment, it's about protection. Not everyone deserves access to you, especially the ones who mistake your kindness for weakness. I started filling my home with things that reflected me, not them. Shelves lined with books I actually wanted to read, art from local markets, a mismatched collection of mugs from thrift stores. Every choice was mine. Every corner of the space felt like breathing room. And little by little, I noticed the difference in how I carried myself. I stood taller. I said no without feeling the need to explain. I stopped apologizing for existing on my own terms. That was the real victory, not the legal dismissal, not the public fallout, but the quiet, unshakable knowledge that I didn't need their approval money or love to be whole. I'd been whole all along. They just never wanted me to realize it. And now that I had, there was no going back. The girl who once thought loyalty meant self-sacrifice was gone. In her place was a woman who knew her worth, guarded her peace, and understood that sometimes the best thing you can do for yourself is to close the door and lock it from the inside. Standing on my porch one crisp autumn evening, I watched the last streaks of orange fade into the horizon and felt a calm I hadn't known in years. The kind of calm that comes when you know every piece of your life is yours, not borrowed, not owed, not hanging by the thread of someone else's approval. People think stories like mine end in fireworks, some grand act of revenge where you slam the door in someone's face or deliver a cutting line that makes the room gasp. But the truth is real justice is quieter. It's in the choices you make afterward when no one's watching. It's in the way you wake up without dread. It's in knowing you don't have to answer the phone just because it's ringing. If anyone asked me now what the biggest lesson was, I'd tell them this loyalty is earned, not demanded. Love without respect isn't love at all, it's leverage. And family isn't defined by shared blood, but by mutual care. For years, they treated me like a resource instead of a person, an endless well to draw from without giving anything back. They thought my value began and ended with what I could provide. But here's the truth they never wanted to admit. My value was never theirs to measure. It was mine all along. I used to believe that walking away was the same as giving up. Now I understand it's the opposite. Walking away is the ultimate act of self-respect when staying means losing yourself. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to let people experience life without your support. Let them feel the absence they took for granted. I've had neighbors and friends tell me they admire what I did, that they wish they could cut ties with the people who drain them too. But I always tell them it's not easy. It takes planning. It takes knowing exactly who you're dealing with. It takes gathering every bit of proof and holding it close not to hurt them, but to protect yourself. Because people who rely on manipulation will twist every word and every memory until they're the victim and you're the villain. That's why you need to know your truth so well it can't be shaken. And when the moment comes, you let the truth do the work for you. You don't need to shout. You don't need to fight. You just need to step back and watch the lies crumble. Since the ruling, I've been asked if I regret not trying harder to fix things. My answer is always the same: no. I spent years trying to fix something that wasn't broken in the first place. The problem wasn't my effort, it was their entitlement. And the only cure for entitlement is losing access to what it feeds on. I keep the framed letter from my sister in my hallway right next to my deed. No hard feelings, she wrote, like we'd just argued over a borrowed sweater. To me, it's a reminder not of the betrayal, but of the fact that I survived it. That I kept my dignity, my home, and my future. And every time I pass it, I smile. Not because I won in court, but because I won my life back. That's the kind of victory you don't need to announce. It speaks for itself. To anyone out there who's been made to feel like their worth is conditional, I'll say this: stop waiting for permission to live your own life. Stop setting yourself on fire to keep other people warm. The people who truly love you won't ask you to, and the ones who do, let them shiver. You've got your own fire to tend to now.